I'm going to go ahead and get started while people trickle in. Good afternoon. I'm Samantha Deutsch, the Digital Art History Lead here at the Frick Art Reference Library. Welcome and thank you for joining us virtually for another lunchtime presentation, Watermark Match Discoveries in Drawings by Rembrandt. Today, Rick Johnson, the Jeffrey S. M. Hedrick Senior Professor of Engineering Emeritus at Cornell University, and a PhD candidate in art history at Utrecht University, and Robert Fucci, a lecturer in art history at the University of Amsterdam, and the Peck Collection Research Fellow for the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill's Ackland Museum. We'll discuss recent research findings. Before I turn this over to our esteemed lecturers, I have a couple housekeeping details. First, today's webinar is being recorded, and please use Zoom's Q&A feature for any queries you may have during the presentation. Lauren Smith, our Digital Art History Research Fellow and newly appointed Assistant Curator at the Frick Pittsburgh, and myself will be monitoring and fielding questions from there during the brief Q&A session following the conclusion of the presentation. So without further ado, I'm turning the floor, or rather screen, over to Rick Johnson and Robert Fucci. Thank you so much.
So, welcome. Thank you to the Frick for having us. I've had a relationship for several years with the Frick, but now I no longer live close by, and it's rather less frequently. So sometimes it turns into one of these talks that lately have also been over Zoom. My colleague, Rob Fucci, he and I are both actually in Amsterdam. He at his house, and I'm at my apartment. That's not the view outside my window there. That's a view from Hawaii, where I live now, where I reside. We've been working together several years on bringing the use of watermarks into the study of drawings. And what I've got to do first is give you a little bit of background on what this means. You know, what are watermarks? Why do they matter? How come people haven't already done this? It sounds, if you know, it doesn't sound that unusual. So next slide, please. So here's a picture of people making paper. And the person that's of interest to us is the one on the left facing us by a thing that says figure 1. And he's dipping a rectangular frame that's got wires in it into this vat in front of him that's heated. You can see the fire heating it underneath in the thing at the bottom towards us. That he's going to plunge this screen in this paper making mold and lift it out. The water drains, it leaves pulp on the screen, and then that will ultimately turn into a sheet of paper. He hands it to the person that's got his back to us, who then takes that one and gives him the one he did previously, but his job is to take the sheet of paper off nice and smoothly into a big stack. And so there's a pair of twin molds that are used. Oftentimes the watermarks in them are very similar. Watermarks are just a pattern of wires that are sewn onto the screen that filters the pulp. Okay, but all the places where the paper rests on the screen, all those wires, at those points, the paper will actually be thinner, and that's how we're going to see the watermark. We're looking at inner properties, structural features of the paper. Next slide, please. So why watermarks? Well, watermarks were distinctive things that the paper making mills put on their paper to distinguish it, perhaps where it was headed, perhaps where the mill that it came from. And here we have a quote from 1982, when watermarks were starting to make their way, of course, into various parts of the study since the early 20th century, in fact. And the big issue is, okay, if I have two things with exactly the same watermark, since they're all handmade and therefore somewhat different, then if I can say they're exactly the same, what window am I talking about within which they would have been made and marketed and used? And the sense is that the common mold for making these things, because of use and cleaning during the time that it's being made, the paper's being made, is roughly 2 years, maybe a little bit more. So, but in the study of looking for similar or matching watermarks, the designation identical was that all of these wires that are revealed in the image you're taking, which at this point is low energy radiography, beta radiography, is that that image of the screen needs to be the same in the ones that are exactly the same. If the watermark's a little different, maybe it's the same screen, but it's just been damaged or cleaned or something, but that's not necessarily at the same time. That's from later use. So we're going to be looking at this most stringent requirement, because if the watermarks are identical, as a quote at the bottom says, in a study on trying to classify the watermarks in Rembrandt's prints, is then they're made on the same mold, and we call those mold mates. Next slide, please. So now, why do this? But this has been around for a while, this idea of finding exact matching watermarks that can be used to answer questions in different fields. In bibliographical studies, it was an issue with whether or not a certain book called the Missale Speciale was one of the earliest ones, made with movable type, earlier than Gutenberg. And Alan Stevenson used watermarks to help date the papers, and concluded that they couldn't be any less than 6 years or something like that older than when Gutenberg's were early things were printed. So that was a big major controversy solved with the watermarks being the primary evidence. 20 years later, Alan Tyson, a musicologist, studied the autograph scores of Mozart, meaning the ones that he signed. Now you got to understand there's also a little bit of changing the signature and stuff. So you're looking for his handwriting in the score itself, because sometimes the dates got changed to put them as things written in his peak, which made them more expensive. Anyway, it's a tough problem. And he used watermarks as well. And he compared watermarks in papers and was able to trace when things were purchased and other things were written using the same papers, etc. And then you'd fast forward another roughly 20 years. Everything seems to be happening, and it takes 2 decades for another subfield, I guess, to really put these things into motion. And this was studying Rembrandt's prints, and the whole idea was to develop a chronology, and that was done by Eric Hinterding, started by the Ash and Fletcher that I mentioned on the previous slide. So what we're doing now, after the next 20-year hiatus, is essentially looking at, hey, why not why not do this for drawings? Now, one of the drawbacks is was considered that, well, drawings, the piece of paper, one of a kind. You don't go buy a bunch of paper and make a book with it so that there's lots of sheets in this book that have the same watermark, or you don't go buy a stack of them and make prints of the same plate, which would have the same issue, which are the areas that have been looked at previously, primarily. But if you were actually able to look across drawings by all artists in a certain time and period, assuming that the market produced the quantities of different kinds of paper somewhat uniformly over that area, then there could be a lot said about those interconnections. So that's next slide, please. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with something that comes from the print literature. So I've got to first turn you into experts at looking at watermarks. Okay, so here we have the watermark in the center and the right are watermarks from presumed to be from the pair of screens that were the twins that were used to make a batch of paper. And we find these in prints made of the same plate that shows up in the print on the left. So a certain state first of 5 of print by Rembrandt that's signed and dated. Okay, and if you look at these 2 watermarks, they look pretty similar. Okay, so what you're going to have to do is imagine what kind of level of detail you're going to have to use. This is why this is difficult for the computer, no matter what the machine learning people would say, because we're talking about a few hundreds of examples, not hundreds of thousands. And the details are quite small. So I'm going to draw your attention to the right end of the horizontal bar in the cross, pretty much in the center of the watermark above the lamb, and look at the right end of it. And one of the watermarks, the tip is touching that vertical line next to it. Now, normally I would ask you if you could raise your hand or something if you can see it or not, to see if anybody's, so if you're with me though, look at the one that's on the left, it doesn't touch. On the right, look at that one, it touches. Okay, so they're different. And most people, I would have said the first time somebody showed me this, says, oh, really? That makes a difference? I mean, really? Well, it turns out this is just an example of how similar they can be, and they were actually made on different molds. And we're only knowing that these are twins because both have shown up in numbers in this particular impression of this particular plate and the impressions from it for this print. So we have that piece of information. Why is that interesting? Next slide, please. Because here's a drawing of Rembrandt's. And there's a note in the collection catalog, online catalog, that says the watermark is similar to Hinterding catalog D.A.A. Now, I realized that you weren't taking complete notes, but on the last slide, those two were D.A.A. and D.A.B. from Hinterding's catalog of all the watermarks he discovered in Rembrandt's prints. So here we have our first example of a drawing and a print being on paper made off the same screen, and for the distribution of paper through the Netherlands, and some things about the use of materials by artists. These types of facts will be an addition to the study of not just drawings. But let's go to the next slide. What we're going to do is try and figure out, if this is the same as the one that we had the image of before that came out of Eric's book. Okay, so how are we going to do that? Well, this is our technical innovation, but basically you take the part of the problem that's hard for the computer and easy for the human, and let the human do that for a couple of minutes, and then you let the computer do the stuff that's hard for the human. And essentially, rather than assuming the computer can do it without much instruction. So, but basically, we have a problem where if we can mark common points on the left, we've done that for our watermark, that is the one in the drawing, and do the same marking on the one for the print, you get the video over on the left, which I think you can tell. If you look at it, you can see at the top and the bottom, there's some letters appearing telling you which of the two watermarks is showing. Okay, one of them is the one that's just fading is the drawing. The one that's showing up now is the one in the print. Look closely, because we probably don't have enough time to study it that closely, but this, you can at least see that little space next to, from the right end of the cross is okay. It's there. Everything else matches. So, so this just confirms the observation that was made. Next slide, please. But it does say something about the date, and it turns out the thing is that it shows up the same connection as now. Here we have a drawing by a Rembrandt pupil that there is recognized that it's similar, says identical perhaps to the watermark. So here we're going to do the same thing again, but this time we'll take the watermark from this drawing and compare it to the watermark from the print. And you can see the video overlay, which is the new thing that takes the user less than 5 minutes to mark the points and then run the creation of the video. And then you have this thing that allows you to do extraordinarily close looking at all the points where the wires are on top of each other. And they should be if they're going to be an exact match. Next slide, please. That's not all. Here's another drawing. So now we have a Rembrandt print, a Rembrandt drawing, and two drawings by other lesser artists, but named in this case. They're both Willem Droost. The other one's attributed to a little less secure attribution, perhaps. And you know, I can't think off the top of my head. I should have checked, but the dates are probably consistent with his time as a pupil of Rembrandt. Next slide, please. So there's no surprises here. It's just that I'm trying to show you that this extra piece of information actually can confirm something that you already had presumed. So it can be added quite effectively to the forensics. Here's another drawing attributed to Willem Troost. Oh, wait a second. Look at the watermark on the right. Okay. It's also rotating, but where's the end of the crossbar? Can you see that? It's touching. This is the other one. Do you see what I'm saying? This is the other DAB. And now what we've found is a drawing that's not by Rembrandt, but a drawing that has the other twin watermark in its paper. So you would assume that this paper was also used at about the same time. And that's a cross we can only make because we went back through the prints, found this connection, and then brought it back to the study of the drawing. Next slide, please. Wait, there's more. I almost want to be like an ad or something, right? So there's more. There's the same watermark shows up in a dated document. Okay. And then here's the video, and you can see the date is all right in the same time frame. So what this example, next slide, please, shows is all these different ways that having a watermark match can actually give you different kinds of information. I mean, it'd be interesting to know that Rembrandt may have occasionally used the same paper for drawings and prints. It might be interesting to know that Rembrandt occasionally used the same paper as a pupil of his did, or that there's a match between a pupil's drawing and a Rembrandt print, or a pupil's drawing and another pupil's drawing. And pupil could be broad. It could be people drawing in the style of Rembrandt, but actually never having been in his studio. And these drawings by not Rembrandt drawings and dated documents. We can have some information about twins if we bring in the prints. And we also had an example here where one of these drawings had no date whatsoever. I don't know if you noticed, and so connecting it to the time of the document such in the print will be a help in advancing understanding of that drawing. Next slide, please. So actually, you can do this multiple times. So here's some Rembrandt drawings, and you can see these. This is a red chalk drawing from very early in his career. And it has a double-headed eagle that just happens to be its watermark. And if you look at the video that's rotating back and forth on the right, it matches, and we know it matches another entry in the Laurentius catalog, the catalogs by the father and son that documented the watermarks of documents in the Zeeland archives in Middelburg. And this is entry number 397. Yes, you have to look through a lot of them to find the one that matches. That's going to be history really soon. That's when, after that, I'm telling you about, that's when I'll pass it over to Rob. Next slide, please. Here's a picture of an elephant, a drawing of an elephant. There was an elephant touring Europe. Rob might say a little bit more that came through. And there's another sign drawing in 37 by Rembrandt. But evidently the elephant came back later. And some people, I think, would consider this as stylistically improved, at least I do, in the skin and such. But these other drawings had been always connected to the previous date. Here, the watermark matches with a piece of paper dated, a document dated 1642, and others have noted that that should probably be an influence in reconsidering the date of this drawing. Next slide, please. So here's one where the drawing dates are quite different. And this is a very complicated watermark, which matches quite nicely between a drawing of Rembrandt's and a dated document. So there's the range of things where it's bringing in confirming information, and sometimes information that might think you a little bit more carefully about some of the decisions that have been made for dating, at least in this case. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. There you go. Thank you. So now here's the big kahuna, according to Rob, because this is the thing that really changes the playing field to a certain extent about how much we can do this. Watermarks haven't been used that thoroughly in paint drawing analysis in the past for various reasons, and by that same token, they've not necessarily been imaged to the same degree that paintings and prints may have been radiographed for various conservation reasons. So, so the other thing too is they're now all digital, and how do you share them? I mean, how do you compare your watermark to a watermark in a drawing at somebody else's museum? Okay, in the past, everybody had to agree to take images that were exact the same size of the watermark and then exchange them. Turns out to be pretty awkward. Not a lot of that's done, and accumulating the images can be a time-consuming process. Okay, but now that it's happening on a scale, and people are actually starting to put some of these images online, some museums like the Morgan and the British Museum, and then there's books that have these watermarks in them. I've mentioned the Laurentius catalogs a couple of times, and the Hinterding catalog, and Ash and Fletcher. And so here's our idea. What if we were able, remember we marked points before? What if we took all the ones that were pretty similar and marked them at the same points being where the tip of the wing touches so-and-so. So in other words, you have to look for that feature that should be in the one that's identical, and it's probably there in the one that's similar, and you put a mark there. So that you follow instructions, you do that for a handful. What if I, as a great courtesy to your advanced studies as an art historian, had actually spent a month or two going through these various catalogs and taking out the ones that were all of a certain type, fool's caps, and then marking them all at the same points. So there's two kinds of fool's caps, 5-pointed fool's caps and 7-pointed fool's caps. If I can do that, what happened is that the thing we use for computation, this is the beauty of adding computational things to art history studies, can sometimes tell you additional different things. And in this case, what we get at the end of the calculation is a number that tells us how close it was. So what if we checked our new one against everything in the library, which computationally doesn't take but a minute or two, and looked at that number for every one of them and looked at the smallest one? If it was small enough, I bet that's a match. And it turns out that turns out to be the first mechanism for a searchable watermark library from the image only. Next slide, please. So what happens when you do that is that you do this for, I'm going to show you the picture in a minute, but this is the bar graph that we get by comparing it to all of the 5-pointed fool's caps in Hinterding and the two Laurentius catalogs, almost 200. Okay, and you can see that they're about a third of the way up on, there's one short one. So we take, the next slide, please. So we take that short one and make an overlay video. That's on the right. The drawing's on the left. It's a drawing by Jan Levens, and it's an exact match. So the period that the museum cites as possible for the drawing is that's consistent with, if you will, with what's noted for the dated document. This is a big deal because the next slide, please. The same technique with bars can be used to show that it might have no match with a certain group. And in this case, we matched it again against all of the drawings where we had watermarks that were 5-pointed fool's caps and ran the same thing. And our own one that we had marked was in this set. So that's why you get that blank in the middle, because that error fitting is exact. So the bar, there's no error. So that's why the bar is not there. It has no length. But it's there for all the others. And actually, if you look at the scale at the bottom, all of the others, the number is above 1. Okay. And usually once it gets above 1 on these graphs, there's no chance of it being an exact match. So at this point, having turned you into total experts on this new digital technology and how it can show you ones which are exact matches, which then leads you to an ability to use that, certainly in dating information, I turn over to my superior in terms of art history knowledge. Rob, it's yours.
Thanks very much, Rick. Let me just share my screen here. Okay, so I am going to sort of pick up and dovetail with what Rick has talked about a bit here by addressing some of the art historical issues related to watermark matches in Rembrandt's drawings. And I should mention, Rick has quite wonderfully found, I think, about 20 exact matches now with drawings, 20 drawings by Rembrandt that have watermarks with exact matches. If you're wondering about what that represents, it's a little bit difficult to say in terms of his total corpus. There are, 800 or more drawings by Rembrandt that are more or less accepted. I would say maybe 30 to 40% of those have watermarks. What percentage of those have usable watermarks is also a question, and we'll address what usable is in a minute. We have by no means exhausted the full array of watermarks available. So I won't talk about all 20 of those drawings, but I'm going to highlight a few of the different types of matches that have occurred and sort of what they tell us so far, a sort of preliminary assessment of the art historical impact of Rick's project. Now, the first one I'm showing you here is the studies of women and children. So 2 drawings of women and children. It was part of a group of drawings that Rembrandt made in the mid to late 1630s and early 1640s. They are all quite wonderful. One of the most understudied groups of drawings that he has, really, and there may be a 2 or 3 dozen that survive today. We know he made over 100 of them from his inventory from his estate sales. But what's interesting here is that these drawings traditionally bore quite different dates from a connoisseurial standpoint. The drawing in the Ackland Art Museum on the left used to be dated in the mid 1630s. Benesch had it around 1635, and the drawing on the right for a long time was dated in the mid 1640s, so about a 10-year difference. And there is a watermark that scholars recognized early on was quite close. And often one of the ways to address the discrepancy in date was to, make the plausible suggestion that maybe Rembrandt picked up a piece of paper that he had purchased years before and then decided to make a drawing on it. But what's fascinating here is that the connoisseurship has kind of brought the 2 drawings together, more towards 1640 in both cases, despite their somewhat different appearances. I should mention the drawing on the left is wonderful in that it's the only one of the women and children that has an inscription by Rembrandt's hand. It says a child with an old jacket on his head, referring to the infant on the left. So Kinderkind mit dem alle Jakob, son Hoofdkind. And that's interesting for a couple of reasons. One is it makes this drawing a core work. It's indisputed by Rembrandt, so it's useful for studying in comparison. But it also, goes to other questions about how he was working also. But why I'm showing you this is not just because it was a match that sort of confirms, in a sense, connoisseurship, because we don't have a document date to go with this particular set of drawings, but they do appear to have been made around the same time. But I seem to, yes, here we go. What's interesting here is that one of the watermarks, the Ackland sheet, is actually a partial watermark. So this has to be treated slightly differently. You can see the video on the right that shows the watermarks lining up. So I was researching this drawing. I had asked Rick to mark this drawing separately. So Rick was talking about the marked library of watermarks, which is incredibly useful because once you have a library of watermarks, you can mark any questionable watermark you have and submit it to the software, and it will tell you right away if there's something in the library that matches. For partials like this, you have to mark it individually. You have to customize it, and you have to match it. If you think something is close, then you can do this sort of thing. So by way of answering the question, how can partial watermarks be handled? Because such a high percentage of watermarks are, in a sense, fragments. And the answer appears to be, well, if you have most of a watermark, you can still work with this method. And so that's also interesting. But you need enough to make it convincing, as it is rather in this case. So what is the takeaway here? Well, this is a drawing to drawing match, a Rembrandt drawing to a Rembrandt drawing, which is one of the things the Pascal Lamb that Rick showed earlier did not have. It has nearly everything, but not a Rembrandt drawing to a Rembrandt drawing. But there are only a couple of these where you'd see Rembrandt using paper from the same batch of sheets. And it does seem to suggest that there's some useful information to be had here. Now, as far as matching the drawings to documents, here is the Sacrifice of Manoah, which scholars for many years, going back to the Neshivan, have always put in the mid to late 1630s. And indeed, the document match that Rick found, document in the Ceylon archives from 1638, does sort of confirm that traditional connoisseurship. So that's really quite wonderful to see in a number of cases, quite a number of cases, that our traditional assessment based on stylistic criteria and very traditional terms of connoisseurship can be confirmed in many cases with these watermarks from the archives. Also interesting that the paper that was being used by Rembrandt was also being used in the archives. There is quite a bit of overlap, it appears, that the artist would necessarily be using something different that was often quite the same. And you might be wondering, okay, well, how reliable is this system? There's a couple of assumptions that are being made here. One is that the paper in the archives was being used rather rapidly, from the point of purchase to the point of use within the space of a year or so. For this to work, for us to say, okay, well, these documents were all made, around 1638. Can we really date these drawings to that period? That's a valid question and one that we're concerned with. And one of the ways that might be useful in addressing it is actually look at drawings that are signed and dated. And I'm showing you here another work from the Ackland. This is the signed and dated drawing by Cornelis Saftleven from 1658 with a double-headed eagle watermark. And Saftleven dated quite a number of his sheets. Some artists dated their sheets quite commonly, some artists did not. Rembrandt did not very frequently date his sheets at all, which complicates matters a bit. But what we can do is we can target these dated sheets with watermarks. And if there is a match with the archives, we can start to look at, get an idea of how closely these dates line up. Now, in this case, the document date from the archives was also 1658, so it lines up exactly. So we're starting to gather watermarks like this as well, which don't necessarily function art historically to help, refine a date for a work of art, which we already know is dated, but might help give us something like a baseline or some sort of control group from which we can sort of assess, well, how many of these matches are close in dates? What percentage of these types of matches are exactly the same year from the archives and the drawing as in this case, or maybe 1 year off, or do we find wide discrepancies as well? And we've only have a few of these so far, but they do tend to show that these drawings were made within a year or so of the documents found in the archives. There are 1 or 2 cases where there might be a broader gap, but in general, I would say that this does seem to show that our assumptions about paper use is on fairly reliable ground. Now, returning to Rembrandt, to show once again matches that line up quite wonderfully. These are 2 drawings that are on the same batch of paper. Both have the dove watermark that you see also illustrated here, and that watermark is also found in the archives, dated 1629, which confirms traditional connoisseurship going back many decades for these works as well. These figures were very much from Rembrandt's late Leiden period, when he's looking at more humble figures and influenced by the etchings of Jacques Corot, for example, and making etchings himself along these lines. That's an Italian watermark. We know this because the the watermarks and circles like that tend to be Italian, and there's the chain lines that are slightly wider spaced. So interesting that this Italian paper is being used both in the archives and by the artists as well. It was not exclusively something that the artists are choosing to use because it had maybe some particular quality. And these three, there's no document match here, but fascinating in this regard is that the drawing in the center, in the Tylers, is actually signed and dated by Rembrandt, 1631. And it's long been assumed that the matching watermark on the sheet in Berlin was made around the same time. It gets a little more interesting when you look at the first state of the famous Jewish bride, the etching, which is only dated in the third state of the print. So it's one of these famous examples of Rembrandt's unfinished sort of proof-looking states. But there are a number of impressions that survive. 4 of the first state, at least 10 of the second states are known. And then it's finished in the third state, and the date of 1635 is applied. Now, of course, it's once again possible that he picked up a sheet of paper that had been lying around for a few years and decided to print these proof states, if they were indeed proof states, on this paper. But it might also be worth considering that he began this plate a little bit earlier than we thought. So here's an example of maybe how drawings can inform us potentially about his print practice. And that's kind of interesting. But also here you see, and in a number of other cases also, we see that Rembrandt was using the same paper for drawings and prints. And that is potentially significant because you also find pen and ink works, which require a certain amount of sizing in the paper. The sizing keeps the ink from running. That they weren't necessarily prepared differently, at least coming from the manufacturer, but that they were both being used more or less interchangeably in Rembrandt's studio. Now, getting back to Rick's example, where there's a little bit more of a date discrepancy. The Phoenix in a wreath is a type of watermark that you really expect, that the close match really is a very close match. And that is certainly an earlier date than Peter Schapborn's assessment of the early 1650s, which Schapborn bases on very solid connoissorial criteria, that it does very much relate stylistically to the Homer drawing in the Pandora album that for Jan Six, which was dated 1652, and that he treated the Tobit subject in an etching dated 1651. So, again here, could Rembrandt have picked up an older sheet of paper? Yes, possibly. But worth noting is that when you go back through the literature, earlier connoisseurs, including Fritz Lucht, who owned the drawing, was one of the great Rembrandt drawing connoisseurs, assumed that this drawing really came from the mid-1640s. And you find this occasionally where the older connoisseurship or the older connoisseurs, you find that their dating, which maybe in more recent times has been adjusted, tends to hold up under some of the watermark dates that we're finding with the documents in the archives. Now, stepping away from Rembrandt a second, we are also looking at drawings by quite a number of other artists. So not just Rembrandt. Once you have these libraries of watermarks built up, you can look at a foolscap watermark that by any artist. And once again, this is interesting for the fact that a certain strain of connoisseurial argumentation is that of Felice Stamfel, who argued that it was a later, more bravura style by Liepins. Samofsky and Jane Turner put it earlier, 1635 to 43, which was Jan Liepins's Antwerp period, where he was in close contact with artists like Anthony van Dyck before he died in 41. And this has a Van Dyckian, there's no trace of Rembrandt here, it's more in the Van Dyckian mode. But the watermark does seem to suggest something slightly later. And looking at these other artists is potentially very fruitful, especially for the ones whose drawings have proven difficult to date. And Jan Liepins is certainly a case where after his Leiden period, where he was working closely with Rembrandt, he went on to have a brilliant career. A lot of these black chalk portraits are difficult to date. A lot of his wonderful landscapes are very difficult to date. They often bear quite wide date ranges in the 1650s and 60s. None are dated. They're very difficult to pinpoint. So these watermarks could potentially be useful for even narrowing down to a decade or even half a decade our understanding of when some of these works were made. And that goes for an artist like Roland Rothman also. Here is a match found, another phoenix with for a drawing that Peter Skaaform quite sensibly dated between the Castle series of 1646 and his trip to the Alps in 1654, and indeed the watermark confirms something from that period. But he is an artist that has proven particularly difficult in terms of developing a kind of sort of chronology of his drawings, because he had a 4-decade career. Houbraken even mentions that he worked well into old age, but only the drawings from the first decade of his career bear any dates, if they're dated at all, which often they were not. So we have quite a large body of drawings over a 3-decade range that are pretty much up in the air in terms of date, and we are hoping to pursue dating some of those as well, since so many of them do bear watermarks, and we're hoping to find some matches there. So that's a future direction. And there are other artists like this as well. Allard van Everdingen comes to mind also, an artist who produced today, there are over 650 drawings by him that survive, quite a number with watermarks, but only, I think, fewer than 5 have dates, and the rest of them have proven nearly impossible to pin down, even to a decade. So I think there's great potential in this technique that Rick has developed. I think that with all the caveats and caution that one should have in the study and interpretation of watermark matches, it nevertheless proves very fruitful. And certainly for the study of Rembrandt's drawings, it will help refine our understanding of his development and the chronology of the works. So that's what I have, and I turn it back over to Samantha.
I'm actually going to take over for Q&A for a bit, Rob, but thank you so much, Rob and Rick. We are going to start going through some of the questions, so please feel free to include them as we start answering. First, we do have a comment for Fernanda, who is from NYC, but had recently traveled to the Rembrandt Museum and said it was wonderful. So I'm sure many others will hopefully be making a trek out there with the exhibition going on at the Peck Collection. So to start off with the first question, how was the 2-year lifespan of a mold been determined? Mill records, potentially? I believe this is from your part of the talk, Rick, when you're going through the process of paper.
Yeah, there's actually very few records. It mostly depends on some records they have in Italy, at least as I recall in my reading. Other people might know more about that, but I think that's rather tight. There's a book by Neil Harris that's online that'll have a very entertaining read, and it'll have a lot of comments about this. And he does put in examples where they last more than a decade. And what seems to be happening in that situation is that the very large molds that make really large sheets of paper were not used as often as the ones that were popular. So if you're making something popular that goes into books and manuscripts and newspapers or whatever's erupting at the time, they won't last long, because they have to really be scrubbed down to get the pulp out from between the wires, and sometimes that breaks pieces of watermarks and stuff. So I would guess I'd be willing to give some slack to the storage issue. But I think we're also finding, we have a couple of examples that we're chasing down that actually are of larger paper, and there's about a 10-year difference between 2 uses of the paper. One's a dated drawing, the other one's a dated document. So we have a lot to learn. The point is that I'm trying to echo Rob here and say, I guess it's worth learning. So
Definitely. This is, Rob, you kind of touched a little bit on connoisseurship, but could you speak a little bit more to how you see this research as well, Rick, contributing to the study of attribution, especially in regards to Rembrandt?
Yes, this is a very good question. I hesitate to say that it can contribute to issues of attribution, since, as Rick has pointed out, there's so much paper sharing apparently going on within the atelier. So primarily useful for dating, and I think chronology and refining our understanding of the stylistic criteria and how we approach these works. And all of that's very helpful, and that can lead potentially indirectly to an attribution issue. But I think it would be somewhat exceptional if to have certain watermark data really point to an attribution. Yes, Rick.
So I think the only place that it might give a little piece of extra information is if you think it's a pupil that you haven't identified, and then you get a date for it, that might then limit your search among the pupils to whom it could be attributed. So that's I agree with Rob. It's not going to be something that you're going to spend a full-time job on, but I also am a firm believer in the fact that once we actually get the database size beyond a certain level, we're going to find all kinds of connections that we hadn't thought of looking for before, because you couldn't get the right kind of forensic available. Now that forensics less expensive, time-wise, et cetera, to produce, I'm willing to bet that the clever people that have better training than I do in art history are going to be able to see a lot of other uses than just the ones that I see the same thing happening in other disciplines. This will go back to the musicologists and the bibliographic people. I mean, it's going to be used in a lot of places in paper.
Oh, definitely. It's a very exciting time with the recent advancements in technology that have made these technologies like you're using and other projects far more accessible to art historians and other humanities specialists. So I realize now I'm not using people's names, so I will start. Leslie Paisley has asked specifically, the sacrifice of Manoah appears to have been used on the felt side of the sheet as opposed to the screen side. Can one say that Rembrandt's consistently used the screen side of the sheet for prints or drawings? No.
No, I think Eric Hinterding looked at this with the prints, and I think his conclusion was it's pretty random.
Seem to notice.
And likewise, oh, sorry, go ahead, Rick.
He just didn't seem to notice.
Oh.
I don't know what other conclusion could be drawn from some of the data I've seen.
Well,
Some artists are really fussy.
You don't want to accuse Rembrandt of being paper insensitive, though. The Japanese papers are really quite subtle, and I would wager that even some of the European papers, if you put them side by side and really felt them and looked at them closely, that you could argue he was choosing different types of papers. It was very subtle with that. This just wasn't one of them, as far as we can tell.
Yeah, right.
Okay. Likewise, speaking to the materiality of the paper, Joseph Levin was curious about if you can see the watermarks primarily when the drawing or print is held up to the light, or if there's other ways to visualize it with the naked eye.
Oh, with the naked eye. No,
that was my add-on, I should say.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that if you have transmitted light, you're going to see the surface image and the watermark. So there's a small percentage, I don't know, I shouldn't say that. There's a fraction of them where you get lucky and the watermark's like in the sky or something, and there's not really anything there. And so you can see the watermark. Normally, however, that's really rare. What you get is you can see half of it or a third of it or something like that, because the rest of it is just completely obscured. And prints are worse than drawings because prints usually have, in Rembrandt especially, vast periods of black ink. So, okay, so this is an ad for something that's around the corner, but to facilitate doing drawings, imaging drawings, you could use transmitted light if you also had an image of the surface, because there would be ways to remove the surface image from the transmitted light image, and then you get the inner structural properties as the features that are left over that since the paper was thin, the thinness is now what's being left in the image. That doesn't work unless you can register the two images to incredibly tight levels. But there's a new apparatus that we're testing actually next week at the Tyler's Museum that will actually allow you to take transmitted light, Reiki light, and surface images by pushing one button and nothing changes. So when the images come out, you just lay them on top of each other. Pixel 1 is at the same place as Pixel 1 in both of the images, all the images in that case. This will ultimately be an inexpensive device that we hope will tour the world, and that museums and connoisseurs, collectors could also have theirs imaged in, and then this watermark, and not just the watermarks. Think ahead. You can actually, it appears, use the laid lines to distinguish moles. Those are the wires that are very close together. The big problem with that is that very infrequently are the images of high enough resolution to make those laid line maps. But that's going to happen at some point in the future too. So we're not done. I may be, I'm getting close, but the work's not done for a while.
No, there's certainly a lot to be done, and very exciting little sneak peek of what's ahead. Holly Borham, first off, fascinating presentation, she says, and she's talking about specific images from your presentation. She notes it's interesting that the two Rembrandt drawings of women and children with matching watermarks appear to be two different colors. Is that a condition issue? For example, is paper color a less useful criteria for understanding drawings because of varied light exposure over time?
I think, thanks, Holly. I think in this case, it's actually a photography issue. There was some of the PEC drawings were a little bit too far into the red, we've noticed. So we actually reshot them for the catalog. And I think that's an older image. So yeah, it's hard to really judge the color similarity or difference from the various digital images that you gather from various sources too. But certainly condition plays a role as well. Yeah, it's always, I always found this a plaguing issue in the study of prints, because it's, you think it's the same state on the same piece of paper, but they look completely different for any number of reasons. But yeah, I would say it's not much of a criteria in this case.
Wonderful. I think Samantha's going to take the next question.
Hi, yes, I'm going to ask Rachel Hopkins, I can't read the last name, sorry, question. Will this overlay technology be made available publicly, tied to something such as the WIRE database? Or are there opportunities for institutions to submit their watermark images to be subjected to these investigations?
Yes, yes, and yes. So that software is already available. It's actually there's some newer versions that might be more robust, but it's already available in an article in the Journal of Historians of Netherlandish Art. There's links to it, the articles in the 2021, one of the two issues in 2021. The software at some point, again, I'm speaking out of class here a little bit, but there are plans being made to start a small kernel of a watermark database. And the idea would be is that the software in the entire marked library would all be there. You can download it onto your laptop and run the software and look at all the overlay videos you want to make. And then there'll be a library of ones that have been made on the ones that are sitting online conceivably. So yes, we're planning this, but I think we have to do a lot of foundational work to convince people that we're going to find something that justifies the effort. We can't just ride the digitization wave, I don't think, in this case. Okay, there's because we're asking that a forensic that has been of lesser concern get a lot of attention in the sense of developing resources to really make it a valuable contribution to the drawing analysis. So that's kind of a roundabout way of answering all the questions positively. I'm trying to figure out how you would, if you can't find that article, you can send me an email, and this goes to everybody that's listening. So yeah, I don't expect to get thousands of emails, but you know, it's C is in Charles, R is in Richard, J is in Johnson 2@cornell.edu. And I'm assuming Samantha's going to type that into the
Yeah, I'll
chat.
add that to the chat for everybody.
Okay. So if anybody does have questions about the software or other things to read, or Rob and I are in production mode these days, and because there's plenty of other drawings that we're looking at, and there's other things related to these use of videos where we use them in studying Leonardo's codices. So that's another major project where the matching watermarks played a role.
And I
What
think
did I
we
forget, Rob? What did I forget, Rob, about, you know? Is there anything else we want to tell them as incoming attractions?
I think one of the questions everybody sort of wants to know is, when can we just submit a watermark and have it automatically, you know, tell us?
Oh,
if
yeah,
it's or not?
yeah.
But that's
Okay,
a long ways off.
okay, but I'll soften that one. If it's a foolscap, send it today. Operators are standing by to take your call. Okay, and we will return with you a free copy of a long playing record that has every famous song that's ever been done around the globe. Okay, so yes, we would be happy to look at foolscaps, because our doing them only takes a couple of minutes. And the only requirement is that you allow us to keep it in our library, the image, so that you know, we can boost all of this stuff. And we'll send you a nice PDF file with a, you know, an endorsed report about your watermark. Okay.
Take advantage of Rick's offer while it lasts.
Yeah.
Sending your full steps to Rick right away.
Well, gentlemen and everybody, I think we are coming up on the hour. And so I wanted to give you a perfect send off and say thank you so much for your presentations today. And this is very wonderful. And I keep thinking about Francisco Goya and his drawings and prints, but that's another discussion one day.
No, I'd be after that one myself.
Cool. I'm game.
Goya's this a fantastic topic.
It's someone I studied, so that's why my little selfish comment there. So again, thank you so much. And I just wanted to let everybody know that our next lunchtime talk will be Lauren Smith, and she's going to be talking about her research that she's been doing when she's been at the Frick. And the lecture is called Consuming the World, ? Uncovering Global Exchange in the Montius Database with Natural Language Processing, or as we know, NLP. So thank you so much. Have a great day.